We welcome you to another installment of Ministers Joe and Josh Discuss. This time we're in Genesis chapter 27. All right, well, let's move ourselves into Genesis chapter 27. So we won't read this again. This is another long passage, but we'll probably address it. So I think we're close to Beersheba, where we've ended kind of last time. Isaac gets his bigger well, and he's establishing kind of a foothold in the land with a pretty much the beginnings of an actual town. And that would be the first time for him. And Beersheba becomes a pretty major city throughout the history of Israel. I mean, that's one that remains, whereas some of the other ones can be hard to identify in the future. But I don't want to read the whole thing, but we'll start here. Isaac is old and his eyes are dim, so he can't see. And he calls Esau to him, and he tells him that he knows he's going to die soon. So he asks him to go out and hunt game. So that's all in these verses. And prepare him the food that he likes so that he can bless him before he dies. So that's essentially where we are. And I figure we can start with a conversation about the distinction between the birthright, which previous story was about, and the blessing. Mm-hmm. So I'll say this and let you respond to it, Minister Joe. We actually got this question from one of our families that's reading this together as a family. So it's really cool. Mm-hmm. So the birthright, at least in these texts. Now, I don't want to make unilateral statements about all cultures of the ancient Near East, because we don't know. But the way it functions in this story, anyway, is that the birthright is the material blessing that is owed the firstborn son in this culture. So that's a material inheritance, and the eldest son gets a double portion. So we see that birthright, that material blessing, carrying through the patriarchs. So Isaac does get the birthright. He also gets the blessing, but we'll distinguish that in a moment. Isaac gets the birthright, not Ishmael, right? Actually, Isaac gets everything. The only son of a legitimate marriage. It seems like the other two are concubines, but that's a different thing. Isaac wants to give the birthright to Esau, but he trades that. So Jacob already has the birthright, meaning that when Isaac dies, Jacob is already owed the double portion of the inheritance. So he'll get a larger share of the material wealth than Esau will. And that's because of their deal with the red stuff, the stew. Yeah. So, and then we'll see the same thing happen with Jacob. Jacob will end up giving the birthright, the material blessing, to Joseph. So you'll notice when you see the 12 tribes of Israel, Joseph isn't there, because his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, each get their own tribal inheritance. That's the double portion. So instead of one tribal inheritance, Joseph gets two. So he's going to get the birthright. So that's the material blessing. But the blessing is the spiritual blessing. And it's directly in this story related to Abraham and the promise God made to him. So the birthright is the material dividing up of the material inheritance. The blessing is the promise made to Abraham. So who's going to inherit the promise made to Abraham? That becomes essential. And Isaac wants to give that to Esau. Mm-hmm. Or at least he feels he needs to give it to Esau because he's a firstborn. Mm-hmm. So we'll talk about how that works out. But that's the blessing. And we were asked by one of our families, what does it mean to bless our children? Or what does it mean to receive a blessing today? And really, this is pretty consistent in the Bible. It's the passing on of a spiritual inheritance. So you bless your children by passing on your spiritual inheritance, by passing on the knowledge of God and the relationship. It's essentially the law under the first covenant, and I think the teachings of Jesus under the new. So you're passing that on. That is the spiritual, and Jacob will do that for all of his kids. Jacob gives the birthright to Joseph, but he gives a portion of the blessing, the promise of Abraham, to each one of his children. So Jacob will give you 12 tribes rather than just one. And he may do that because of these experiences. You know, he's the first generation in which the birthright and the blessing are separated. And so he follows the custom. Joseph gets the birthright, but he divides the blessing into 12 pieces and gives each one of his sons a portion of the blessing. And now we have 12 tribes of Israel. So today we would probably follow Jacob's example. And I think Israel was intended to follow Jacob's example and bless every child of Israel by handing on the spiritual promise of Abraham to the next generation. So that's it. But it can also be used in a less formal way by somebody like Elijah, for instance, has a calling that comes with a spiritual blessing. And Elisha asks if he can get a double portion of Elijah's blessing. That's the spiritual inheritance that Elijah can pass on, which is that of the prophet. And he's not asking to be more powerful than Elijah. What he's asking is, God, when you separate out the spiritual bestowment of Elijah on all these prophets, could I get a double portion? Could I be his heir? That's what he's asking for. But that's a spiritual passing on. So that's what the blessing is. And when we say in the Lord's Prayer, our Father who is in the heavens, blessed be your name. That's actually passive. We are not blessing God. We are acknowledging that he is the source of all blessing. So the blessing begins with God, and then it is distributed. If you're reading 1 Corinthians, you might say that the Holy Spirit distributes God's gifts as he sees fit. Those are blessings. Those are the spiritual blessings. And the Holy Spirit passes those on, and sometimes we can pass them on. Jesus passed on the power and authority over the demonic forces to his disciples. That was blessing them. He was giving them a portion of what was given to him and authorizing them to do it. When you, Minister Joe, and myself, when we were ordained, there was a general superintendent who's entrusted with sort of the spiritual responsibility of the church to make sure that the leaders are godly and that they meet the criteria for leadership. And then he blessed us. He passed on a part of what was entrusted to him to us. And that's kind of the way blessing works in an everyday way. So when a parent blesses their children, they're doing one of two things. The ultimate blessing is to pass on the blessing of God to the next generation. The promise is made to Abraham and to all who are faithful. To pass that on is the blessing. But you can also pass on gifts. So like if you're a father and you know how to weld, and you pass on the knowledge of welding to your child, that would be a blessing because that's spiritual, the knowledge. It's not simply a physical inheritance like $100 or a house, something like that. You're passing on something spiritual. So that's essentially how it works in the scriptures. So I don't know if you want to interact with that, Minister Joe, but that's the best I can do.
Yeah, I think one of the things to add is also with the difference between Isaac and Jacob as far as the blessing goes. It seemed like Isaac wanted to keep with the idea of having the firstborn be the one who got the blessing as well, and then Jacob somehow or another, because I really don't know where the whole idea of the birthright came from, other than it seems almost secular.
It is, yeah. I think you're right. It is secular. That's the logic of the culture. But the question is, where did that come from? And I don't know, in the story, could we say that Seth? The idea that Adam did not pass on a relationship with God to Cain, but only to Seth? Somehow, and then we have that line in which this is the family line that walked with God, as though that blessing was being passed down, but it wasn't being equally shared of all children. It seemed almost like one child was receiving it right up till Noah. It might be connected to that kind of way in the distant past. Yeah. But by the time Abraham receives it, it's a very secular cultural phenomenon.
Or more obscure, yeah. But it seemed like the difference between Jacob and Isaac is that Jacob blessed is second to the youngest son. So he chose the birthright for the child.
So the way that works is that you have two wives and they each have a firstborn. So the firstborn of Leah is Reuben.
Yes.
And the firstborn of Rachel is Joseph.
Right.
So these two are vying for which one, which wife will he prefer? And we all know he prefers Rachel, so the likelihood of Joseph being the one who would receive his birthright is pretty high because he's the firstborn of the wife he intended to marry first. And this is all up to Jacob, right?
Right.
So Reuben is disqualified for his birthright because he sleeps with one of his father's concubines. So he is removed. And Jacob will
Yep.
tell him that later, that's why he was no longer considered. So
Yep.
now the next two sons are Simeon and Levi. So now it's Simeon and Levi versus Joseph. But Simeon and Levi kill the Shechemites as retribution for raping their sister Dinah. And that excludes them from receiving the birthright because they've made themselves a stench to the people of the land. So Jacob eliminates them. So the fourth born is Judah. And by the time we get to the Joseph story, it's Judah versus Joseph. And funny enough, Judah becomes the line of David, and Joseph's Ephraim becomes the line of the kings of the northern Israel. So that plays itself out. But really, Joseph seems much younger because it takes Rachel forever to have children. But he's still the firstborn of Rachel. And that's the family dynamics that are being fought about. And Jacob decides to give the birthright to Jacob over Judah. But when he blesses them, he blesses Judah more. So what he ends up doing is he gives the material blessing to Joseph, the birthright, but he gives a larger portion of the blessing. He gives the scepter to Judah. So it's very interesting how Jacob navigates this. But the thing that makes him super unique is that he even though he does that with Judah, he gives some of the blessing to every son. And that creates a weird dynamic where instead of having one heir, Jacob literally has 12 heirs, at least of the promise. So it's Jacob becomes, he doesn't start out great. We're not going to love him in this story, but he turns out to be quite an innovative, remarkable man who finds a way to take the promise of Abraham and let all of his children inherit it. That's something Isaac and Rebekah did not figure out how to do. They exclude Esau. Jacob's an innovative thinker. And you want to say, of course, God is guiding him in that. You'd like to believe. But God doesn't believe that the 12 of them being blessed is essential, because you remember in the story in Exodus that we finished reading, God says to Moses, I'm going to destroy these people and bring a nation from you. And Moses pleads that God would not wipe out the 12. But, Moses is of Levi. God could have he didn't need all 12 of them. He just needed one son of Jacob. So, it wasn't like it had to be that way, but Jacob, it's very creative. I actually really like how Jacob ends his life. He learns something from his long journey and the rivalry between he and Esau. He learns how to and he sees that same rivalry being passed on to his own children because of the way he favors Joseph. And he finds a way to bring healing by cutting up the blessing into 12 pieces.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. But anyway, I just wanted to see how that was working. It's very important to see that Joseph, as the firstborn of Rachel, does have a claim on the birthright. It just depends on how Jacob is going to navigate it.
Right. Yeah. And so that reflects the birth order of Rachel. So that is pretty important to bring that out, rather than it just being favoritism. Most people in the stories, Joseph, which we'll talk a lot about on Saturday at the event for Treasure the Truth program, most people are looking at all the wrong ideas in those stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what Jacob is doing when he gives that coat, that ornate robe to Joseph, is he's signaling to the other sons that he intends to make Joseph his heir in terms of the birthright. That's what he's indicating. And that's what launches everything, because they all, and it makes it especially interesting that Reuben is the one who doesn't want to kill Joseph. And he realizes he doesn't, we'll get into that story when we get there. But at first it's Reuben who saves Joseph. And it's very interesting because they're the two ones vying for the heir initially. So people don't really read those stories in terms of ancient Near East family dynamics, but that's what we should do. But even Jacob is appalled by Joseph's dreams and how he's interpreting them. I mean, that even bothers Jacob.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it does. Those kinds of things when you have to ask, what was he thinking? How did he think these people were going to respond?
Yeah.
So that's a story for another day.
Yeah, all that begins here, though. And Isaac is caught in this. The culture is that the firstborn son should receive the blessing and the birthright. That seems to be the tradition he's operating out of. That's what happened with Abraham for certain. I mean, Ishmael was older, but he was not a child of Sarah. So for Isaac, that seems the most natural thing. And yet we have this prophecy that the older would serve the younger, which Rachel has close to her heart. And maybe Isaac does too. We'll see. Yeah, that'll be interesting. So anyway, the intention of Isaac is to give the blessing, the promise of Abraham to Esau.
Yeah.
That's his intention anyway. That's his stated intention.
Right. And my wife and I were talking a little about this as well too. About a lot of people are hard on Jacob and easier on Esau, and sometimes people are harder on Esau, and just because of the circumstances. It probably would be good for us to talk for a few moments about what the fascination is with Isaac asking his son to go get him his last meal. I mean, this hunt. And my wife and I were talking about it, and I said, well, there was a time where hunting and gathering was a more primitive way of survival. And when you own lots of cattle and lots of animals and property and land, which Isaac inherited, it would be hard to understand why you would rather have your son be more interested in hunting than carrying on the family business.
Yeah.
And we talked a little bit about that in a previous video, I think. And the point is that seems like that's all Esau is concerned about.
Yeah.
And he knows his father likes it. I think that most of us would rather have our father like what we do.
Yeah.
Makes for a peaceful relationship, and brings honor to him. But you have to ask in the end, is that really the most noblest cause?
Yeah. So the first thing that's in play here is this has the smack of a covenant. And the covenant, the word in Hebrew is brit or brit, which means to cut. So to make a covenant, you have to slaughter an animal. So when Abraham made that covenant with God, or God made a covenant with Abraham, he took from his own flocks, and they could have done that. But for one reason or another, Isaac would like the animal that they're going to cut in order to make this covenant, which is the passing on of the blessing of God to Abraham, to Esau. He wants him to hunt game for that. And you're right to point out why that might be significant. And I think part of it is that there's something about Esau, his wildness, his desire to be outside of the camp and blazing new territories, that Isaac very much appreciates. You and I think we talked about, I don't know, was he living through him? Did he resent being Abraham's son? And maybe it's still a hangover from Mount Moriah. And the fact that he was saved by a wild animal and not one of his own flocks. Maybe he gained a taste for wild animals after he was rescued by one. Maybe he thought of wild animals as God's provision. There's so many ways you could read the story, but for some reason, Isaac does not want the covenant animal that they're going to kill. That's what this meal is about. It's about a covenant. He wants it to be wild caught by Esau outside of the camp. And Isaac seems to prefer that kind of animal. Now, we know in a purely material way they taste different. Most people prefer actually farm-raised animals, right? I mean, in terms of taste.
Grass-fed.
They'll often say wild animals are gamey, right?
Yeah,
They'll say things like that. But Isaac's the opposite. He prefers that gamey meat. And, I threw out a few ideas. I don't know if you have some, Minister Joe, as to why that might have developed in him as a taste. But that it's a covenant he's cutting, though. And that's why they have to kill an animal. And you have two options: take from your own flocks and herds, or go catch one. And he wants Esau to catch one. Yeah,
I wonder if I'm thinking right, and maybe this is way far out there, but maybe when Isaac was on that mountain, Mount Moriah, there was there was this idea of eating that wild animal. I mean,
He definitely ate it.
participated in it.
I don't think you're out there at all. You make a sacrifice, and part of it, the sacrificer will eat. So he definitely tasted wild game on that mountain, and it's probably not a large stretch to say that created in him a taste for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially when the adrenaline was high. He thought for sure that he was going to be the one to be sacrificed.
It was probably the best tasting thing he ever tasted in his life.
Right.
And he just wanted to eat that all the time.
Mm.
Yeah, if you eat something in the moment of a high moment of stress, you can make some associations with it. I mean, that's how people become alcoholics, right?
Right.
If they go to alcohol or drugs in a moment of high stress, they can become much quicker addicted than somebody who doesn't go to them in those moments. So I think you've got something there. I mean, we can't say for sure. Only God could say for sure, but I think that's a pretty good inference from the details of the text. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it makes it sound like Abraham just walked away, but
yeah, it does sound that way in the story. And there are early church fathers who made a big deal out of that, because you remember Jesus, they love to associate Jesus with Isaac, because as Isaac carries the wood of his own sacrifice, Jesus carries the cross. Isaac is sacrificed by his father, at least that's what was going to happen, and the father is the one who gives the son over for sacrifice. And some would say that the wrath of God is what kills Jesus. That was one of the older interpretations. So it very much like a sacrifice, even though humans were the instruments of it. There were people who read it that way. And then Jesus says he's abandoned, right? He says, Father, why have you forsaken me? Just as Abraham left Isaac alone on Mount Moriah. There were those fathers that wrote about that. I'm thinking of like Origen, and I think I remember something from Augustine. So those connections are there. And I say all that to say they noticed that the story says that Abraham came down the mountain alone. Like they noticed that. Good readers have noticed that for over 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So it's nothing new for us. Yeah. Yeah. So this is the plan. Go out and catch an animal and prepare it the way I like it, and we'll eat together. So that's a tall order. You don't know how long that could take. We've already seen Esau gone earlier in the story for so long that he came back starving.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not a quick thing. And that's what gives Rebekah time for her plan. Now, we talked about this just briefly. We hinted at it. But I'd like to suggest it here before we read this, Minister Joe, so that we can both be thinking in these directions. Is Rebekah rebelling against Isaac's wishes, or is she rescuing Isaac? And that's an issue, because many readers have read what we're going to talk about and have noticed that Isaac seems very gullible, which it begs one of two directions. Either Isaac is just very gullible, almost to a ridiculous level, or he wants to be deceived. And if he's gullible, then Rebekah's taking advantage of him, and so is Jacob. But if he wants to be deceived, if he's aware of the promise made that the older would serve the younger, but he doesn't know how to get out of his love and affection for Esau, he may be complicit in Rebekah may think she's rescuing him from himself by giving him a chance to be deceived so that he doesn't have to break Esau's heart.
Yeah.
So you never know the dynamics, but I'm inclined to that reading because I find it hard to believe Isaac is this gullible.
Yeah, I agree.
But let's look at it. And maybe I've slanted things a little bit too much, but let's look at it. So yeah. Rebekah's listening when Isaac spoke to Esau. She overhears their plans. So Esau goes to the field to hunt and bring game. And Rebekah realizes she has time now because she's going to take an animal from the flock, so she doesn't have to worry about anything. So she comes and tells Jacob, all right, this is what we're going to do, and I'll prepare the food just the way your father likes it. She's going to have some way of making it taste wild caught, though I still think Isaac would be able to tell the difference. This is my thing. I think the gullibility thing is unlikely.
Right.
And then go to the flock, get me 2 choice kids. I'll prepare them, take it to your father so that he may bless you before he dies. But Jacob said, look, my brother, he realizes I don't look anything like Esau. I mean, the food's not going to fool him. And so our mother says, well, okay, we will put animal skin on you so that you are hairier, and we'll make sure you wear some clothes that make it smell right.
Mm.
And Jacob is willing to do it. And so, and it works.
Right.
Kind of, right? So we'll go back and go through all the details, but Jacob realizes right away, this is like verse 18 and following, that something's off, right? Like he can tell it's Jacob's voice, and he even mentions it. But when he feels the hairy arms, and I think, how hairy was Esau to feel like animal fur? You know what I mean? But he feels the hairy arms, he smells the wildness on him, and he believes it's Esau. Even though he protests, he believes it, and he ends up blessing him. And we'll get into Esau's coming after that and what the blessing actually entails.
Yeah.
But, you know, people have read this story forever, and it's easy for some more, you might call them progressive or liberal readers of the scriptures, to think that this entire thing is just fabricated, because how in the world could a father be fooled by this? I mean, what kind of a father doesn't know who his sons are simply because he's blind, and he can't tell the difference between human hair and animal skin, and he can't tell the difference between their voices, and he's persuaded just by smelling?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that seems so unlikely. So some people think it's a bit of a fabricated story meant to tell some, but I think this is very historical. As I was saying, I'm inclined to believe Isaac wanted to be deceived. I'm inclined to think that he was saving face, that Rebekah was helping him save face, because he didn't want to break Esau's heart. Esau had already lost the birthright, so Isaac was spared that conversation. But now he's supposed to give him the blessing, and I think Isaac is going to do it if he can get away with it. And how many times have you met a parent that doesn't want to have a hard conversation with one of their kids and is looking for a way to avoid it?
Mm.
It seems to me that's what's happening here, because I kind of agree with those progressive readers. Nobody's this gullible, but rather than thinking that makes it fiction, I think it means Isaac was being rescued by Rebekah. I don't think he's being deceived by her. I think he's being rescued. But that's my read of it, and feel free to disagree.
Maybe let me just interject this idea.
Yeah, you should.
Maybe he was wanting to see how far Jacob was willing to go to get this blessing. I mean, he's definitely shrewd enough to figure out how to get the birthright.
Yeah.
Now, how far will you go, even at the risk of deception, even almost like over the top? Nobody's gonna believe you. Like
Yeah.
You know, there were kids in here with the preschool wearing Spider-Man. You know,
Yeah.
and they got the muscles and everything. Like, you're really gonna believe those are real muscles? You know what I'm saying? It's like how far would maybe it's the audacity of Jacob to think that he could actually do that.
But Jacob does bless him.
Isaac did, yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry, Isaac does bless him. So are you thinking that if to read it that way, it's sort of like a competition between the two boys, and Isaac is planning on giving the blessing to whichever one of them overcomes?
Yeah, I think there may be something to say about you when you were saying that you know, he realized that, you know, Esau's the firstborn. He was the first one to come out. He's willing to give his birthright away for a bucket of stew and some red stuff. I mean, why would you want it? And he's got to learn some kind of lesson here, is what I would think. You know, but it feels like he's sending him away in some ways. It's almost like he's got to know.
He's giving Jacob an opportunity.
Yeah, to see how much audacity he's actually going to have.
Yeah, it could be that. Obviously, I used to think that Rebekah and Isaac must be at odds with each other, and that this is a sign that they're at, because it already told us that Rebekah preferred Jacob and Isaac preferred Esau. We're already told that. So I figured this was just an extension of that rivalry. But my concern is, I think that they actually love each other. And
Yeah.
I think Rebekah realizes that Isaac doesn't have the fortitude to do what he needs to do to fulfill the prophecy that was spoken over them at the beginning. And he loves Esau so much, he favors him so much, he just can't bring himself to choose Jacob over him. So I think Rebekah, out of love for Isaac, this is kind of a new direction for me, but I'm feeling very passionate about it. I feel like out of love for Isaac, Rebekah gives him a way out that will save face with Esau, but will get the right thing done. And I think Isaac sees what's happening. He says it right away. Your voice is the voice of Jacob. Like, he knows he's being deceived, but he goes with it.
Yeah.
And now when Esau comes back, Isaac can simply claim he was cheated, and he doesn't have to tell him, I gave your blessing to somebody else. Instead, he can just say, they stole it from you. And I think that's more likely what's happening. But it is possible that Isaac is testing Jacob at the same time. I'm not disagreeing with you that there could be a test involved. But if it was really a test, why would he honor the lying?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that just seems really, really bizarre.
I mean, I'm not painting Isaac very well, granted, because anyone who would sow the seeds of future murder between his children just to keep himself from having a hard conversation is not really a great man. But I think that's what's happening.
Yeah, he might have been losing his marbles too.
He's old.
But
yeah.
By that time, I mean, life and stress make you do weird things.
But you know, when you love your children and you have to give one bad news, that's a hard conversation to have.
Yeah.
And he clearly had a favorite.
Yeah. Well, maybe he didn't see much of a future in Esau. I mean, because of his independence, it wasn't like he was going out and putting food on the table every day. That's what it appears.
Yeah, and Esau already married these two Hittite women that irritated his parents. So I really think Rebekah's helping Isaac save face with his son and getting him out of a difficult situation. And I think Isaac's complicit in it myself. I think he pretends to be deceived. But it seems to me that there's no way this would have fooled anybody. Right.
And the other thing too is that they're not young kids. They're like 40.
Right.
They're like 40. So it's almost like that same kind of surprise we had. We were talking about Ishmael hiding underneath the bush.
Yeah, and he's like 16 years old or whatever.
Yeah, it's like, what is this? The mother threw him underneath the bush. So there's got to be some more symbolism there, some more stuff there, like obvious that Esau just wasn't getting the team player, the Abraham type call. He just had no desire for that.
Yeah, and I think everybody knew it, except maybe Esau. I think they're all complicit in it. I also think it's unlikely Jacob really believed his father was deceived. Like, I find it unlikely. But I think Jacob knows that he's the right one to lead this family. And, I think everybody knows. It's like the unspoken thing. If I were doing a family dynamics workup with this family, I would say, nobody's telling the truth to each other, but everybody knows what the truth is. Right. Jacob is the right one to carry on. Not only was it prophesied, but he also demonstrates the fact that he's more committed to the tents, to the family, to the business, the family business. Esau's kind of his own guy. He's like Ishmael. He likes to go off and do his own thing. So it's pretty clear that God's prophecy is bearing fruit, but nobody wants to admit it. And I think it's complicated by the fact that Isaac really likes Esau. And I think he really doesn't want to have that conversation. I don't think he wants Esau. He already saw what happened with Ishmael. He doesn't want his relationship with Esau to be what Abraham's relationship with Ishmael was.
Right.
Like, Isaac's only experience was that because he was the child of the promise, Abraham lost his relationship with Ishmael and he left. And he didn't want that to happen to Esau. So I think Isaac's in a difficult situation. And I think Rebekah, out of love for her husband and understanding of what needs to happen, she takes it on the chin, and she ends up looking like the deceiver. But I think she's rescuing him from a very hard conversation. And interestingly enough, it does divide Jacob from Esau, but it allows Isaac and Esau to keep their relationship. So it's an interesting family decision here. I'm not saying it's godly, but I do think it's understandable.
Right. It's interesting too that we know it says even before this happens that Esau already found wives and got married, and it was like, it's almost like he's aligning himself with Ishmael's side.
Yeah.
So what that implies is that there's not going to be really any inheritance.
Yeah. Though he is going to get some. Isaac is going to give him some because he's actual son. You're right, though. He's more like Ishmael. Ishmael marries an Egyptian, and Esau marries 2 Hittites. I mean, I'm sure Isaac saw the writing on the wall, but I don't think he wanted what happened to Abraham and Ishmael to happen to him and Esau. He really loves this kid, and that creates the bind.
Yeah, and Abraham did love Ishmael, and Ishmael even did bury Abraham. So,
yeah,
does that happen yet? Doesn't happen yet.
Yeah, that happened in 25. Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about it already. I just,
Yeah.
sorry, lost my mind space.
Yeah, but you're right. But there's a rift, right? Because he has to send Ishmael out, and Ishmael gets no inheritance.
Yeah.
Abraham gives him gifts, but he's cut off.
I mean, let's pull all these fathers into a room and give them some counseling.
But it gets worked out. They eventually you'll find some good dads in Israel. But this culture is working the way this culture works. But you can already see the relationship with God causing changes to it. They're willing to not do it the way the culture wants them to, but they're finding it hard. But each generation does find it easier. Jacob will take a step further in the direction of blessing all of his sons than even Isaac did. But Isaac blesses both sons. And that happened with Ishmael. God blessed Ishmael, but not Abraham. Right? But here, at least Isaac does find a way. So this is the blessing. So let's take a look at this in terms of what exactly the promises to Abraham look like when they're passed down by Isaac to his heir. It says, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. Now, what I'm suggesting, Minister Joe, is that is Isaac's interpretation of the promise made to Abraham in chapter 12. But it's different in Isaac's mouth, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a little like Eve. Do you remember when the serpent says, did God really tell you that you can't eat from the trees of the garden? Now, we remember that actual promise was made that actual warning was given to Adam. Eve was not yet created. But Eve has interpreted differently. We can't even touch it, she says. Now, that's not what God had said to Adam. It seems similar here. Like this has the elements of God's promise to Abraham in chapter 12. Cursing, blessing, nation serving, all that stuff. But it feels different.
Yeah. At first, it makes me think of Joseph's dream. That's what it, came out first. I know that probably throws a curve in the conversation, but it is different than what we hear in Genesis 22, where the call comes to Abraham.
Yeah.
And so
he adds material blessings into it, right? Grain and wine.
Mm-hmm.
That is his interpretation, I guess, of inheriting this land. But he also wants him to give him the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth. That's very Esau-like, right? The hunting and the living in the fields and things. Jacob will experience that, but it's just an interesting interpretation. It's almost as though Isaac understands the call of Abraham to a call of travel. because remember, Abraham's called out of Ur. And so there's something implicit here for Isaac that the call will always mean moving around. So he's got that sense. He's got the sense that it's going to be established, though, because the grain and wine idea, you don't get that by wandering around. You have to actually plant crops and whatnot. And then he sees the nations as serving. That's different, right? A little different. Because the primary promise to Abraham was that he would be a blessing to all nations. And God would curse those who cursed him and bless those who blessed him. But this idea of the people serving Abraham, this seems a little nuance added by Isaac.
Right.
Maybe he's reading that into chapter 15 and 17 and the additional promises, but that does seem a little different. So again, what we have is Isaac verbally passing down the promises made to his family by God that comes through Abraham to him and then from him to his next son, but he's interpreting it.
Yeah, he's customizing it.
As he understands it.
Yeah, customizing it for what he wants for his son.
But it's clear enough this is Abraham's blessing. And that's what Isaac means when Esau finally shows up.
Mm-hmm.
And Esau says, you got to bless me. And he's like, I gave it away. And now the question for Isaac is, did I save anything? Is there anything left of Abraham's blessing that I can still give to Esau? And that's the mental thing. Did I leave anything out? Because Jacob will specifically divvy up that blessing so that there's something for everybody. But Isaac did not prepare to do that, I guess. Or did he? Did he save something for Esau? Was he complicit in this? And he's so ready to bless him. Part of me thinks this was the plan all along. But in any case, that might be giving Isaac too much credit. But he is ready with a blessing. Ready to go. Right? So Esau comes back. And this is verse 30. As soon as Isaac finished blessing Jacob, when Jacob had scarcely gone out of his presence, Esau comes back in. He had prepared the food. And he says, sit up and eat. And Isaac says, who are you? I'm Esau. Isaac trembled violently. So I still think that this is a good acting job on Isaac's part, but he's selling it. Yeah. Who was it that hunted game and brought it to me, and I ate it all before you came, and I blessed him, and he shall be blessed. And Esau heard his father's words. He cried out with a great... So Esau despised the birthright, the money, but boy, did he want this blessing, right? We'll get into that. And Esau heard his father's words. He cries out, and he says, bless me also. And he said, your brother came deceitfully, took your blessing. Is he not rightly named Jacob? You know, the one who grasps the heel. For he supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and look, now he's taken away my blessing. Then he said, have you not reserved a blessing for me? And Isaac says, I've already made him your Lord. I've given him all his brothers and sisters with grain and wine. I've sustained him. What then can I do for you, my son? And Esau said, have you only one blessing, father? Bless me also, father. And Esau lifted up his voice, and this is what he says to him. Then his father Isaac answered him, see, away from the fatness of the earth shall be your home, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you break loose, you shall break his yoke from your neck. Talk about a custom-made blessing for exactly who Esau is.
Yeah.
You know, that's why I think it was planned.
Yeah.
But anyway, so talk to me about what you see there, Minister Joe, in this interaction.
Well, definitely. It's obvious that, you know, and for him to quickly be able to say, it was Jacob who deceived me.
Yeah, it's like, wait.
Yeah,
knew it was Jacob.
Yeah, I knew it was him all along. I would have got away with it. Was it those meddling kids?
Yeah.
You know? Scooby-Doo, you know. But yeah, you see, you know, that there's always the blame game, the stuff that comes from the garden, and yet you realize that as you hear those blessings, you actually begin to, like I was saying before about the familiarity of things, because we know later on when Jacob wrestles with God, and then he encounters Esau later on, that what was said in that blessing to Esau is actually true.
Yeah.
It's what happens.
Yeah.
What happens.
And to say away from the fatness of the earth, that he's going to live in the fields, that Jacob is going to rule over him, which is what God prophesied, so he can't take that back. But then he would be able to throw off his yoke. Like, this is custom made for Esau. It's the best possible blessing you could give to Esau based on who he was. That's what, so it makes me think Isaac knows his son well.
Yeah. He can see the writing on the wall at 40 years old, and is already married to 2 other women. And you know, I mean, he can see it. He can see it. And, you know, I mean, when I think Isaac was smart enough to know that, you know, God was the one who provided the ram. I think he's probably smart enough to see here that, you know, in the words of Gamaliel, if God is in it, you are not going to be able to stop this.
Right. And this, of course, Esau becomes the Edomites.
Yes.
And Jacob, of course, becomes Israel. And they do end up at odds. And there are long periods of time where the Edomites are under the control of Israel. But then there are also periods where the Edomites break free and even rule over Israel. So it's funny that this dynamic Isaac has set up with these 2 blessings, they play out through time. And there is a prophet, one of the minor prophets, written to the descendants of Esau, and that's the prophet Obadiah. And so Isaac finds a way to make sure that the future of Israel is entwined with Edom. So Jacob is never free of Esau. So even though it's not quite what Jacob will do with his 12 sons, it's a little bit better than what was done with Ishmael, at least in terms of keeping him close to the covenant.
Yeah.
So Jacob can't give Esau the blessing, but he can keep him entwined with the ones who have it. And that's what he does in this blessing. He makes sure that wherever Jacob goes, Esau is entwined with it. And you and I might think, well, that's just what he says. Certainly they put these words in his mouth because they knew what happened next. But that's not the way the story works. The way that the Bible understands things is that the spoken word actually has effect in the world. And so Jacob, these blessings are also prophecies.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The screen locked up a little bit in the middle of what you just said. So
Oh, got it.
I got it on the high speed there, and I was like, oh.
Sorry. Well, at least on this side where the people,
me.
where the people are recording, it didn't happen because I'm recording here. But yeah, I think that for Isaac finds a way to make sure that the Esau is entwined with the people of the covenant for the rest of history. And the people of Israel believe that speaking that is prophetic, that God blesses the patriarchs with the ability to prophesy what will be. So it's not as much that they're anticipating what God wants, but God is willing to enact what they say. And so God does make sure that these promises come true. But it's out of loyalty to the patriarchs he does that. It's very interesting how words work. But we've already seen what we saw it with Noah. We see it with Abraham and Isaac. And now we see it here, that these words of blessing, they have power to affect the future. And it's probably, you and I don't quite have the authorization of God to do this in the way that they did. But you and I have enough experience as parents to know, and we've worked with enough children, that the words parents speak over their children do affect the future. If you belittle and ridicule and put down your children, if you become impossible to please, they are affected by that forever. And if you are too easy to please, they're also affected by that forever. And so you really do speak the future into your children when you speak at them. And that's encapsulated here in the story.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I know people, I've been told myself when I was a kid that, why aren't you more like your brother? Or, our brother's a marine biologist.
Yeah.
You know, it's, but also there's that reality of what God does in us, transform us, break that mold, be impossible.
Yeah, the difference between your parents or
I-
my parents and this is that God is with Isaac. So the words he speaks, he's almost speaking on behalf of God in a way, whereas our parents are not always speaking for God. And so God will speak words over us that will direct our future much more powerfully than the words our parents speak. But if our parents are with the Lord and walking with him, they have the power to bless as well. But most parents who don't do that, they have more power to curse than to bless. But even an ungodly parent can speak words of blessing that direct their child's future. And that's the power of words. We started out this whole discussion with a discussion of the power of words and reading the Psalms, and it's right here in the story. These words are powerful and effective. Because God is faithful to them, but still, words change the future.
Yeah, I told somebody recently that blessing your children is probably one of the greatest gifts you could ever give. That's words of affirmation. That's words of encouragement, discipline, direction.
Yeah.
Within the context of giving them freedom to learn.
Yeah.
Not smothering them.
Yep. And blessing children also does, as you said, require correction and discipline. Like the Proverbs say that the one who doesn't discipline his son hates him. So it's not all words of affirmation. Sometimes it's words of redirection, but they're blessings if they point towards God. And the best blessing you can give to your child if they're walking away from God is to show them their sin and try to redirect them. That's the harder conversation. And I think Isaac can also be an example of somebody who doesn't want to have a hard conversation with his son and tries to avoid it and ends up in this situation where his wife has to rescue him and his younger son has to take the responsibility for his father's cowardice, which ends up driving a wedge between the two boys that has to be reconciled many, many years later. And you and I have both known parents that put their children in this situation because of their own cowardice. So it's something to learn as well.
They force their children to grow up too fast, or make them do things that are unnatural for the age that they're at.
Yeah.
That can make scars and difficulties.
Yeah, it's
and risks.
very important for the adult to be the adult in the room. And in this situation, as you can tell, Isaac, for very complicated reasons, I think his love for Esau, his fear of that conversation, his desire not to hurt the son that he favors, I think all bind into it. But in the end, Rebekah and Jacob have to be the adults, and Isaac and Esau are infantilized. And fear will do that. We often say that it's very important for adults to be the adults. And we don't see that in Isaac here.
Yeah, he seems to want to be more of a colleague and friend.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, he almost reveres Esau. The story almost puts it as though he's taking a subordinate position to him. And parents can do that, especially if their children are highly successful at things that they don't find themselves good at, but always wanted to be good at. Whether it's athletics or intellect or, marriage and family or whatever it is, parents can put themselves in that submissive position. And that's not a good position for a parent because it doesn't give you the ability to actually direct.
Right.
So I think we see a lot of those dynamics here in this family, but I still think that this love between Isaac and Rebekah that happened early on, I still see it here. Love manifests itself in strange ways, but it usually always manifests itself in a desire to rescue the other from their own worst tendencies.
There's definitely a corrective here but again, I think so many people put more of the emphasis on the deception than the realization that there's some real trouble, some real difficulty going on.
Yeah, I hope I'm not minimizing, or that neither of us are minimizing the pickle that parents can be in when what they hoped might be true about their children is being proven untrue, and they have to take back some of what they promised. That's why you be careful of the promises you make. Like, you never tell your children they can be anything they want, because sometimes they say, well, I want to be a doctor. And by the time they're 17 or 18 years old, sometimes that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And are you going to be the one to tell them? Or are you going to let their teachers tell them, or their college professors? Who are you going to let have that conversation? Well, Isaac is the type to let someone else have it.
Right. Yeah.
And
Michael Jr. Michael Jr., who he is, the comedian. He says, I was so excited. My son came to me and says, I want to be a doctor, Daddy. And he's like, oh, yes, this is great. My son's going to be a doctor. He says, nah, maybe a dinosaur.
Yeah, those hard conversations, we shouldn't minimize how difficult it must have been for Isaac to contemplate how he was going to get this done.
Yeah.
And he was taken off the hook. But it would have been better. I think we can all admit it would have been better had he been honest with Esau from the very beginning, that it wasn't his destiny. It wasn't what God wanted for him to lead the family. But he allowed Esau to grow up with the impression, even though God told him in advance. But I used to think maybe Rebekah didn't tell Isaac, but I don't believe that anymore. I think he knew the whole time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, him just saying that easily, Jacob deceived me. And, it's like, it's really look at it, it's kind of obvious. Yeah. Hey, why don't you go out there, check this out for me and come back.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a very honest story, I think, and really can help us in a lot of ways. What are your takeaways? Because we won't get into what happens next, which is, well, I guess we can just say it. What do you think was going to happen after that encounter with? We'd probably guess Esau's going to want to kill Jacob.
Oh yeah,
And that's how this story goes, right? We're right back at Cain and Abel.
I'm going to tear you limb from limb.
And that's exactly what happens. And so Esau doesn't want to do it while his father's alive. So he after his father dies, or he plans, once his father dies and he gets through the mourning period, he's going to kill Jacob. And Rebekah gets word of it. We're not told how, but she says to Jacob, it's time to get out of Dodge.
Yeah, I think it was the screaming of Esau yelling, I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill him. I think it's pretty obvious.
Yeah. So she sends him away back to her home, and Jacob gets ready to leave. And then Isaac's still not dead when she does that. So Esau's planning in advance, and she says she wants to get Isaac ready for Jacob to leave. And so another ruse. But I'm sure Esau is not stupid. He probably sees it too, but she gives him another way to save face. We can't let him marry a Hittite. Why don't we send him back to my home? And Isaac agrees. So, and he gives him this charge in chapter 28. So that's where we are, but probably it's good to just end on the fact that this whole thing led to a rivalry between Esau and Jacob that seems very similar to Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
And it was for the same reason. Abel received God's blessing. Cain did not.
Right.
So Cain wanted to kill Abel. Jacob receives Isaac's blessing. Esau does not. So Esau wants to kill Jacob. It's the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. What's mostly crazy about it is that I think most people try to read, focus. They miss the wrong parts of the story. I think they tend to want to focus or identify with the rivalry, with the birth order, and these kinds of things. And that I'm afraid that they're missing, maybe missing. Most of the time, people read this story, they just think of the deception, like we said earlier, and the favoritism and the family. I think it's because people are more prone to think like that.
Yeah.
And they're forgetting that there's a more important story to be told here.
Yeah.
Of direction and looking at how they interact with God and their relationship, how they perceive God, what they would carry on, their propensities, or
Yeah.
like I think Lewis talks about their bent,
Yeah.
the bent of and then the idea of training up a child in the way he should go. It's their natural bend that that is going to either bring them away, away from God or his calling. And so I think often people get caught up in those details. It's like, it's like some people in the garden, when they talk about the garden, well, did Satan have legs, or did the serpent have legs, or I mean, what does it really matter? It's the what's the real issue is what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah.
The real issue isn't revenge. The real issue is, maybe Esau was mad at Jacob because he realized how much he missed the point.
Yeah.
But he still made choices after that.
Yeah, and I mean, when somebody defrauds you of something, when they get there first, it's infuriating.
And I'm talking about like self-loathing. Like he mad at himself. Why did I do that?
Yeah.
What were they thinking?
Yeah, I think it's always complicated. Hating another person and hating yourself are often very much connected feelings. In fact, people who have a lot of problems with other people often have a self-loathing at their own heart. And I think you probably do see that in Esau, and you can tell that he does want to be better, because when he does find out that his parents don't like these Hittite women, he does try to marry someone from Ishmael's family to try and appease them. So there is some self-esteem issues throughout this family, but I think that's always the case. I think self-esteem is an issue for all of us. I just been reading a book in which the author argued that it's often believed that the most natural state of humans is pride, arrogance, self-righteousness that leads to wickedness. And he said, but the truth we're learning is quite the opposite, that the most basic thing is self-loathing. That most people are more apt to care for their dogs than for themselves. So he was using the example of, if you give a human being medication and you tell them, if you don't take this, you'll die. But if you take it every day religiously, you'll have a normal life. He said 60% of people will not take those pills. He said, why would you do that? Because the same people, if you gave their dog the same medication and told them that as long as their dog takes this every day, they'll live a normal life, but if not, they'll die, they will religiously give their dog that medication. So why are they taking care of their dogs more than themselves? And what he was arguing is that most people find other creatures and other people more worthy of being cared for than themselves. And that's the self-loathing. And I see that a lot. I see people who would sacrifice anything to help somebody else, but they won't take care of themselves at all.
Or their own problems.
Their own problems, their own health, their own self-care. They'll let themselves be walked all over. And this particular author was arguing that that's because people are deeply self-loathing. They don't really love themselves. And it expresses themselves sometimes in these ways. I'm not saying that's always the case. I've certainly met pride. But there's a lot of that in Isaac's family. We've already been talking about this low self-esteem and whatnot, and we think it might be related to Mount Moriah, but I feel like you're cooking potatoes in the microwave.
Yeah, the message from Tammy. I have the pizza already. Yeah.
All right, that means it's time for us to wrap up. So what are your final comments, Minister Joe? What's your takeaway?
Well, I would basically say, if you are in a family that you feel is really dysfunctional, this is like not just immediate family, but families in general. I mean, there's always those struggles that are there. I would say resist resist the temptation to just give up on those relationships, to avoid them, to not deal with those issues. It doesn't mean that it has to be talked over at Thanksgiving meals or dinner meals or in ways that are explosive or irritating. But I'm saying it seems like in this text we see things just being ignored, relationships that could be dealt with in a better way. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is I would encourage you, because I've known people who have had that have family strife in their family, and I just think it's tragic when people will have things in their lives that have separated them for lots of years, and it might have been something really simple or very aggravating, but could have been dealt with in a way that would promote healing for a relationship.
Yeah.
And I guess it's just a part of me that says it's just a shame to think that people will go their whole life and never deal with things that divide.
Yeah.
And I think in this text we see a family that is got some real problems, some real things that we're dealing with. Even Abraham himself and was struggling with things. And it doesn't mean that just because they were following God that they were exempt from problems.
Right.
But I would say that we have to learn to find ways to talk about them, to deal with them, to be reasonable and nice with each other, in a sense that the target is not necessarily the person. It should be to have a better relationship.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we learn, or we learn further down the road when we read Genesis about the relationship between Jacob and Esau. We'll find more about that later. But my concern is that people will walk away thinking that this passage is okay to have revenge when you don't feel like you're treated properly.
Right.
Relation, whether you're, my parents did this. Well, you can go your whole life saying your parents should have done this or should have done that.
Yeah.
And so
that's what Paul calls being a slave to sin, or a slave to the flesh. When you allow the bonds of the past to dictate your future. They will dictate your future if you don't think about it, if you don't take any proactive measures. That is what will happen. You'll be completely controlled in ways you don't even know. But we need to be led by the Spirit, which disentangles us from the power the flesh has over us. But yeah, that's what you're talking about. And I will say, though, I do hope people get some encouragement from this text. If you think that God only chooses people from perfect homes, and that if you come from a broken home, or a home that was dysfunctional, that somehow you're broken and tarnished and God can't use you, you got to read these stories again. We already talked about it in the cave with Lot, and that Ruth eventually comes out of that. But even here in the patriarchs, there's so much dysfunction in these families, and they're not like pristine examples of how good family relationships should go. And yet this is the family God called, and he's slowly shaping them into more godly versions. And there certainly will be descendants of Isaac, like Boaz and Ruth, to bring together the story of Lot and the story of Jacob and Isaac and all that. Boaz and Ruth are an amazing couple who are entirely different experience than what we see here, and they're down the line. But God purifies over time, And so if you find yourself to have come from a messy situation, never convince yourself that because of the humility of your origins, that dictates what God can do with you.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't.
I would almost say that almost God will use some of that dysfunction to create something beautiful. And nobody wants to walk that way. Nobody wants to be told.
No, it is a gift, and we're trying to help our parents start our kids off in a godly home that's healthy and functioning as God would have it, because that's a great start for children, and that is a wonderful way to start. My point is just, if you didn't have that blessing, it's never too late.
Right.
as this story can tell you. Jacob is going to improve as a human being remarkably. He still carries with him some of the scars, but I think by the end you'll see that he tries to remedy the sins of the past.
Right. And the power and work of God in us is at work to transform them.
Yeah.
And even those who look like they might have it going all together, all well on the outside,
Yeah.
don't just think that it's easy. God is at work.
Yeah.
There are things that are happening.
Yeah. It's a good story. It's amazing to me how these stories in Genesis, I mean, I think those of us who have faith in God have no difficulty saying that these are inspired, because I mean, God just preserved the right stories in the right way to get at the very heart of what it is to be human. You know, I mean, these stories, he preserved them because they're all of our stories. And I think that's why the more you read them, the more truthful they become. And it's important to imagine yourself as a character, just not always the hero.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because sometimes you'll be Esau. I've been Esau.
I was going to say, who is the hero there?
Yeah, well, I mean, Jacob probably gets off with the most material benefit.
Oh,
but it still comes with its own curses. But I've been Esau. I mean, I've watched somebody get blessed over me that I thought shouldn't have. I've been in that situation. How do you deal with it? And at other times, I don't want to say I've ever stolen anything. Maybe I have. I certainly knew how to steal my father's affection as a kid in a way my brother didn't have the skill for. So in some ways, by kids knowing how to play on their parents' sympathies, they sometimes do steal the blessing from their siblings. That's that you know that sibling, you know who that sibling is, because the parents always say, why can't you be more like them? So maybe your brother was good at that. So you know, it's the Eddie Haskell thing, right? Is that too old a reference for most of our listeners?
Might be, yeah.
Hey, Mrs. Cleaver, it's so good to see you. You know, he knows how to schmooze the adults. That's stealing a blessing, right? That you don't have a right to. So these stories are universal. It's important whenever we read the scriptures to ask, Lord, where am I in this story and what can I learn?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it's quite powerful. And sometimes it's not just your parents. It might be other people that are speaking into your life too that affect your feelings about who you are. But when you keep your eyes on that and you listen to that voice, that you're listening to the wrong one.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Minister Joe, and thanks everybody for joining us. I hope this conversation was helpful and it starts some conversations in your own spiritual life, because the point of these stories is to be practical. They're meant to help us live the lives God's called us to live. So I hope it works that way.
Thank you.